You are here on a Father's Day. That's always a special time when we think about our fathers and think about what they have done. And so this evening I thought I would spend a little time talking about fathers. It's a good topic, isn't it? But you mothers can listen in, and really the principles are the same, whether it's a father or a mother that I think we have. When I think of a father, of course, I think of my own. And some words come to my mind automatically whenever I think of a father in a home. Let me give you some words that I think of. Wisdom. Isn't that great for a father to have some wisdom? What about stability? Always there, always ready for whatever situation may happen. Discipline. Boy, I remember that belt, don't you? Discipline was one of his favorites. Strength is another area that I think of when I think about a father. And you know, every need, every family, I don't care, and I don't think this is a woke crowd tonight, right? You're not woke. So every father, every family needs a father. I don't care what they're telling us today. It's just the way God designed things to be. And these are the primary duties of the father in the home. Whenever Ephesians talks about a man, he talks about the leader. And in our society today, the father should be the leader. That's his position. That's what he is to do. The wife is to be a responder, but the husband is to be the leader of the home. And so, therefore, fathers are to do some things. They are to provide some protection. It's your responsibility, men, to protect your home. And that's not just when somebody breaks in. That means from what's coming on the internet, what comes into computers, and all the other issues as well. So protection of the home is the responsibility of the father. Guidance is another area that needs to be handled by the men of the home. And also problems. Every home has its problems, doesn't it? Boy, you know, I could even tell you about a few of ours. I'm not going to, but, every home has its problems. It's just going to be a natural result of living, because if Annette and I both thought alike, one of us is unnecessary. I've often heard that. And so there's going to be some differences of opinion whenever you start to live in a home. And it's just the way things are. But problems have to be handled in here's the important thing, God-honoring way. Isn't it great when we handle things in a God-honoring way, whenever he gets the glory and the credit? There's really four primary factors that all of us have to contend with. It's going to be a part of our homes. You're going to face them at one time or another, no matter who you are, whether you're a husband or a man, or a husband or a wife, but it's just going to come. Let me give you these four real briefly. This is all introduction, folks. You've got to, first of all, when it comes to a home and everyday living, you got to deal with people. Isn't that true? I remember one time up at Wayside, whenever there was nobody in the school, I went over and walked through the school, and I thought to myself, this will be a grand place if there wasn't any kids in the school. But you know, that kind of misses the purpose, doesn't it, when you think about that, as to why you're there. And I know that you've had the same situation, but then when you get into a home with not only yourself, because your heart's wicked, and mine is too, by the way, Jeremiah chapter, I forgot the passage, but it's Jeremiah, someplace in that place. Not only is my heart wicked, but then you have a wife, her heart's wicked. And then you have children, and they're wicked too, aren't they? I mean, we like to put it up and dress it up the best we can, but folks, that's the facts. And so you get all this wickedness together in a home, and you've got some problems which the husband and the father has to take care of, and it's his responsibility to do so. Another area is the events that's going to happen. Nobody knows what tomorrow holds, right? But I know the one who holds tomorrow. We just sang about that. But nobody knows what tomorrow holds. There's going to be some surprises. Do you really want to know what's going to happen to you tomorrow? I don't. I'm going to Pikeville. Boy, that's a good place to go. And Timothy's gone. I'm going to go with him. He has a dentist appointment, so we're going to go to Pikeville. You know, there could be some surprises on the road. I'm coming down Tacoma Mountain this morning to go to church, and there was a wreck right in front of me. There are surprises all over the place, aren't there? That none of us really expect, but they can happen at any moment. So you have to know how to handle that, and you need the wisdom and the guidance and the stability that God gives to us. What about decisions you have to make? That's a big one. Decisions are all important because all of us face decisions. No matter who we are, there's going to come decisions into our path tomorrow. What you're going to put on, for one thing, that's not a big issue. But, it's just one of those things that happens. And so our decisions need to be based upon the Word of God and what God tells us. And we find that many times we leave God out of our decision making, and really life is going to be the result of that. That'll be our next one. And then we put our own human ingenuity. And boy, something, we are so smart. I realize how dumb I am every day, because God's Word really gives me the answers that I need. The last one is the results. And so we have people, events, decisions, and results. All of us are going to deal with that, no matter who we are. It's going to happen. It's going to happen to you this evening and tomorrow. And the results of that is that you've got to live with the consequence of your decision. No matter what decision you make, when you stood before the preacher and said, I do, you have to live with those consequences, don't you? It's just the way it is. And we're going to have to do that. And a father's decision not only affects himself, but it affects the family and others, ones he's involved with. God is the one that we must worship and obey, and He will give us what we need. I love that one in James chapter 1 where it says, if any of you lack wisdom, boy, I can put my hand up. Let him ask of God, who giveth to all men, and here's the only time in your life you're allowed to be a liberal, who giveth to all men liberally, and He will not fail us. Boy, we need that source of wisdom, don't we? Especially in the world we live in today. Especially when it comes to individuals around us. And so this point here needs to be in the introduction that we need to be godly. Isn't that a great word? I want to be godly. I want to have God controlling my life. And I don't want to be ungodly. Jerry Bridges wrote a book called Respectable Sins, and he defines ungodliness. Let me give you just a couple quotes from this chapter that he talks about respectable sins and ungodliness. He defines it this way. Ungodliness may be defined as living one's everyday life with little or no thought of God, or God's will, or God's glory, or one's dependency upon God. That's a good definition. Ungodliness is living my life with little thought of God or even God's glory in my life. He says, now the sad fact is that many of us who are believers tend to live our daily lives with little or no thought of God. Boy, this was convicting when I was reading this. It's easy just to sort of scoot along, isn't it? Or skate along. Not think about a whole lot. Just let everything kind of happen. But whenever we start living our daily lives without thought of God, we can even read our Bibles, we even pray, he states, at the beginning of the day, but as we go through our day's activity and basically live as though God does not exist, that's ungodliness. It can happen to a believer. He also says this, what he condemns, now he's talking about a verse in James chapter 4 about going one place and spending and not. And he says what he condemns in that place is not planning, but not acknowledging dependency upon God. Now, we got to depend upon God all the time for everything. One more quote, he states this. He says, do our prayers reflect a concern for God's will? I had to really stop and think about that one. When I'm praying, do I reflect God's will and praying about God's will or God's glory? Does my prayer life reflect a desire to please God? It's very convicting, because I don't want to live ungodly. I don't think anybody does. Now, if I had a show of hands tonight saying, how many of y'all want to be ungodly in your life? Nobody would raise their hand, would they? It's like nobody wants to go to hell. It's just the way it is. We want to be godly, but it still means that we have to allow God to work in our hearts and our lives. And we've got to live as if God is constantly involved in our lives, and He is, right? One of those first-class condition sentences that we have to see. So let's take a look this evening at a father who I think did an awful good job, or I would say did a good job, because God puts His stamp of approval upon his life. And so that man would be the name of Job. So turn to Job chapter 1. We're not going to think about Satan. We're not going to think about his suffering. Well, we'll think about that for a little bit. But I want to think about Job tonight, and I want to look at what kind of a dad he was, what kind of a father he was. And so chapters 1 and 2 really deal with this, and you're going to know the account. So I'm not going to read it to you. I'll read some verses to you to give my outline and my points that I'm talking about. But I find that in this section we have three areas or three things about his life, three actions that are important. First thing I find is his record. He's got a record in the first few verses, and down in verse 8. And then he's going to have his relationships, his relations. And thirdly, we're going to see his road. So we want to see, first of all, his record. Then we're going to see his relationships. And then thirdly, we're going to see the road that he travels on, okay? And we're going to see what kind of a father he is from these three areas. First of all, notice his record. Chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And here we go. And that man was perfect and upright, one that feared God and eschewed evil. If somebody describes you, if somebody describes me, what would they say? What do they think? Because you know it's true. All you got to do is mention somebody's name, and there's a mental image that actually pops into your head, isn't there? It has to. Because of certain qualities that you see. I can mention somebody's name, and instantly in my mind there are images that come up because of the character and what I know about that person. So when people thought the name Job, here's what they thought about him. He was perfect and upright. He feared God and he eschewed evil. What a testimony. Those are great words. In other words, he was a man without hypocrisy. You know, hypocrisy even rolls off your tongue dirty, doesn't it? It's a terrible word. No hypocrisy in Job. Perfect? Now, you say, boy, I wished I was perfect. Well, it's not that he didn't sin, because you know as well as I do, only one man lived perfectly in this world, and they hung him on a cross. So he wasn't perfect, but he was one who, as far as he was concerned, was mature and did what he knew to be right. He was perfect and he was upright. He maintained that quality, and others knew that that quality was in his life. When they thought about Job, they thought about these kind of qualities. He feared God. He wasn't cringing of God, but he respected God and who he was. And he eschewed evil. He hated evil. Boy, we need more people like that in our world today, don't we? Who just hate evil because there's so much of it around us today. It just seems to prevail every place. Eschewed. Isn't that a good word? We ought to start using those kind of words again. He eschewed evil. He even makes it sound worse. That's the kind of person he was. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also, verse 3, was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, a very great household. So this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. He has more stuff than some of the kings of Israel does. This guy's done it. I mean, he is the top of the corporate ladder. And he's done it, as far as I can see, from being honest. And I know these words usually don't go together in our modern day culture. He's been honest. He's dealt right with people. He's been he's been a man of integrity, and still he prospers like nobody else. Even some of the great kings of Israel do not prosper the way this man prospers. He's got it all. So I would say he was a hard worker, wouldn't you? Because let me tell you, even though he's got servants, you got to have an administrator to have this kind of a family and this kind of a situation. He's got to know what's going on. He's got to keep his handle on things. You ever been to the which one was it we were at the other day? I think it was the Wendy's there in Wise. I'll tell you, some of the managers are a whole lot better than other managers, aren't they? I mean, sometimes you stand there for half an hour. It puts a whole new meaning to fast food in some of these places. And then you got another place and somebody's on the ball. I mean, they're just snapping people around. You got to have a manager to have this kind of a asset base that you find in verse 3. So he was a hard worker, but he was successful. But also he has 10 kids. My goodness, it's a lot of children. I mean, I can think of very few people I know today have 10 kids. But he did. He was honest. He didn't gain his means by trickery, or else he would not be known as a man who was perfect and upright, because let me tell you, as soon as you start making shady deals, people know, don't they? They can tell you all about it. So he didn't cheat anybody. He didn't put his thumb on the scale when he weighed out the sheep or whatever you want to do. He was honest, upright. So when people thought about Job, they had a certain idea that came up. But what does God think about him? That's important, isn't it? People can think one thing, but what's God's testimony? Verse 8. Just jump right down to verse 8. Under his record, we're going to see his testimony not only with men, but also with God. Verse 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, well, this is when Satan comes and he accuses Job. The word Satan means accuser. He comes before God. And God says to him, hast thou considered my servant Job? Now, God is speaking about somebody in this earth. I wonder what God would say about me tonight, don't you? If God was evaluating you, I wonder what he would say about us. Boy, those people down there, that person over there, I could tell you. No, I hope he would say good things. But notice what he says about Job. It's almost a repetition of verse 1. Of course, the Spirit of God has written both, so we have that. There was none like him in the earth, perfect and upright man, one that feared God and eschewed evil. Isn't it great to have that kind of a standing before God tonight? Oh, that would be true. That God could say, that person lives for me. They're godly in all their thoughts. They're godly in everything they do. Nothing about them is outside the realm of who I am and what I'm doing. Oh, that would be our testimony. Oh, that God could say that about us. And the important part here is, people in the first 3 verses could see his actions and what he did. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. God could see his heart. And God knew what his motivations were. I can look at you and I can say something and I can mean something completely different. But yet when God looks at your heart, he knows exactly what you mean and what you say and how he puts them together. God says, this man's motivation, this man's heart matches his actions. Boy, isn't that a compliment? To think about somebody who God could say, I know what motivates this person. Because really, I don't know you, do I know what motivates you? You don't know me, do you know what motivates me? Motivation is the real key issue in our lives. So the first thing I notice is his record. But let's think about his relationships. Look at verses 4 through 5. First relationship he's in is with his family. And his sons went and feasted in their houses. Every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting was gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did. Notice the adverb continually. Continually. It wasn't hit or miss. He is one who held his family relations very, very close, and that is a credit to Job. Boy, I have heard and seen some family fights that would set your hair on end, haven't you? Here we find that Dad is responsible for how these kids get along. Now, I know exceptions can happen. We're just talking about Job tonight. But Job raised 10 godly kids, as far as I'm concerned. They're all going to die. But he raised 10 godly kids. So family relationships were important to him. And it's a credit to the parents. Because you know what? You know this. I'm going to tell you anyway. Isn't that good? Our children know exactly what's going on in our homes. They watch us. They read us. They know when we tell a lie. They know when we're not honest. They know everything about us. Job's children knew him. And yet they held together. When there's a birthday for the 10 of them, there'd be a lot of birthdays, wouldn't there? I wonder if Job and his Mrs. Job got their birthday day also. I don't know. But, they all got together, had this time together. Because he was consistent. He did not play at religion. It was part of his life. He does not sacrifice when it is convenient. Boy, how many times do we just worship when it is convenient? We do the things for God when it is convenient. No, Job, every morning he rose up early and he makes a burnt offering according to the number of each child. He specifically lays down a sacrifice for that child because who knows, he may have sinned, and I want my children to stand before the Creator righteous. Isn't that the prayer of a father? What greater thing can you have than having your children gather around you around the throne of God and know Him and love Him and sing praises to Him? And then we can talk about grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all the way down, offspring. Every day he does this. He was a man who does not just sacrifice when it's convenient. You know those kind of individuals. You know, they come to church when it's convenient. Or they serve God when it's convenient. Or when they read their Bible when it's convenient. Whenever I can fit it in someplace. Not Job. This was priority. Priority number one. And here's another big thing. You know how life works. All of us do. Riches did not tear this family apart. Boy, you've seen that one play out, haven't you? Some money involved. Ooh, you better take off the gloves. Not these 10. Dad and Mom did something right. And they get along. It didn't tear them apart. Their home is a place the spiritual life was nourished. It started there and it was nourished there. Really, that's where Christian life should live, is in the home. We find that he didn't give up. He was faithful to the end. And so we find that his relationships, first of all, to his family, well, he's going to do all he can to keep them close to God. And thus did Job, verse 5, continually. Not when he felt like it, not when the time was right, but he had a schedule and a plan that he was going to serve God. Homes need that kind of stability. Well, that's his family. What about his friends? Go to chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. And you find what kind of relationships he has with his friends. These three come to see him in verse 11. This is after all the events take place. Verse 11 it says, and when Job's three friends heard of this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from their own place. Eliphaz the Teemite, Bildad the Shumite, and Zophar the Nethanelite. For they made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. They rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads towards heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Can you imagine a man who has this kind of friends who would come and sit there for 7 days and not say a word? Job must have made an influence on these guys. And somebody rightly said, you know, they were more of a comfort when they were not talking than they were when they were talking, and that's probably true. But still, they were there. They cared. This was a man who understood friendships and how these friendships work. So his relations not only to his family, but to these three individuals that he knew. Maybe it's from business. Well, he handled his business. I don't know how that came about. But we find that that's his relationship. So we see his record. We see his relationships. Third, let's look at his road that he has to travel. Well, in chapter 1, we go back and we see the road that this man has to travel. And the first thing I notice is that his road is going to be taken up by being devoid of possessions. Verses 13 through 22, we find in verses 8 through 12 that God and Satan are having a conversation in heaven about this man, and that's where God gives his testimony about him. But in verses 8 through 12, we have to also understand that Job never hears the first word of this. He's not there listening. You know, he doesn't have his ear to the door and say, now what's God saying and what's Satan saying? You know, he's not eavesdropping. He doesn't have some kind of a bug in the throne room. Okay? So he is devoid of all this information. And we find that God allows these trials to come into his life for a purpose. Verse 13, you know the event. One day they're there, and all of a sudden, all of his kids are gone, all of his oxen are gone, all of his horses are gone. Everything is gone, and my count, he's left with 5 servants and Mrs. Noah. He goes from being the lead man of the earth with all this substance to 5 people. Life changes quickly. You say, life, I'm going to say it again, life changes quickly. One car wreck will change your life. Now, I don't want to be morbid, but it's a fact. Our lives was changed 10 years ago when I walked into my dad and mom's house, and there he lay. Quickly, it changed. Folks, it can change quickly. And don't let anybody tell you that's not true. No matter what road you're on right now, your life can change. My life can change. And it can happen to the drop of a bucket, and it happens to this guy. And how do we handle these changes? It's by our relationship to our God. It's the only way we can handle these changes. This is just another day. This is just a time whenever he gets up in the morning, he offers his sacrifices for all of his kids. Think about this. He's there with all this stuff going on from verse 5 and how he's doing this so that each one will have this right with God idea. And things are going along as daytime, and he gets up, and here's Mrs. Job with him. They're all together. Things are moving along throughout the day, like any other day would be. And before nightfall, it's all gone. It couldn't happen to me. The FDIC guarantees everything I have. Folks, if you want to put your faith in the FDIC, go right ahead. Goodness gracious, who'd want to trust Joe Biden with anything? That's a political comment I shouldn't make. But anyway, it's just the facts, isn't it? One day, it's gone. One day, everything has changed. How do you handle that? You ever stop to think about it? How would I handle that? None of us, let's put this disclaimer out there, none of us have been through what Job went through. I don't care how hard your life has been, you cannot claim equality with Job or equity with Job with this situation. So we don't understand all this, and we don't understand how difficult it could be for him. But it really comes down to this question. And folks, I hope you get this if you don't get anything else this evening, because this question haunts me. And it doesn't haunt me, but it's a question that I constantly have to evaluate my life by. The question is this, and I'm sure Job had to ask this in his mind. The question is this: can a man love God when all the gifts of God are removed? Think about that. Can a man or a woman love God when all the gifts of God are removed out of your life? Haunting, isn't it? Makes me ask the question, and Piper talks about this in his book, Pleasures of God, and also we have others who do the same thing. Tozer's big on this as well. He's being a little mystical, but the point is, do I love the Creator, or do I love the gifts the Creator gives? It's a good question. Sometimes God has to bring us to the point where we have to make that decision. If God takes everything away, do I love Him? Notice He is the I am. Not the I was, I will be. He's the I am, which means His name is for now. Is God good enough in Himself that He can be loved for Himself? Or is God loved for the pleasures that He brings and what He provides in our lives? It's a good question. One that we have to ask ourselves. And Job had to come to that point. Do I love God because of all of verse 4 or verse 3, all the camels and all the she-asses and all the great household, all the kids? Do I love Him because of all this stuff? Or do I love Him because of who He is? Folks, that question makes all the difference in your life. That's the difference between godliness and ungodliness. It's not talking about whether you're saved or not. That's not the point. Are we godly? Do I love God because of who God is? This news came in one day. Probably after Job had offered his sacrifices. Probably after the day had begun. And all this was to ensure God's favor, remember? He's doing this so that his children will be right with God. So he's going through his daily ritual of being sure that everybody's right with God, and yet God just wipes it all out. What's Job's reaction? Well, you find it in verse 21. Now let's start at verse 20 of chapter 1. Job rose, rent his mantle, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this God sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Boy, what a statement. Could we do it? You're flat broke. And even your family's gone, except maybe for your mate. That's where he's at. And yet he can stand and say, God, you're good. God, I love you. I love you no matter what. Now, I'm not reading into the text. You see it right there for yourself. His reaction was to worship God. Job did not worship and praise God just in the good times, but in the difficult times when he had to trust. This reminds me of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah. Whenever Abraham is bringing the knife up and he's ready to plunge it into his son, his only son, the son of the promise, and God stays his hand and says, I'm all mixed up my names tonight. Moses, I can trust you because you have given me your best. And at that point, he could enjoy everything God gave him, but he had given everything to God. That's the only time God can really trust us, is when we give it all to him on his altar. Well, his road goes through his possessions, and he takes everything away from him. But remember this, if you have your health, you got everything. Well, I've heard that one before, haven't you? As long as I got my health, man, I'm set. Well, God's going to work a little bit more on this man, isn't he? 7 through 10 of chapter 2. Here's the accuser coming back again, and he's testifying again about him, and he says, well, no wonder he's healthy, and if you just take his health away, man, then he'd curse you to the face. Doesn't Satan say that? He says, he's got skin for skin, verse 4, and so on and so forth. And so, verse 6, God says, okay, Satan, go ahead. So he puts forth his hand, verse 7 of chapter 2, from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. I've had a battle with gout, and folks, I tell you, if one part can hurt that bad, I can't imagine what everything hurts like that. But that's where he's at, right? And notice his medicine. Isn't this a great medicine? He takes this potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Here he is, the lead man of the East. This guy had it all. Here he's sitting in here with all these boils festering, and he's scraping them off with his potsherd. And his wife says to him, boy, I've just about had enough of this, because, folks, she stood by the same 10 graves that Job stood by. She wept the same tears that Job wept. She had the same emotion that he had, and she knew how hard it was on her and how hard it was on him. And so she finally gets that place, says, why don't you just curse God and die? Why do you retain your integrity? Verse 10 again is a great statement of faith. He said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. What a testimony. What a man of strength. Lost his health. Job's answer is one that we must admire. Is God only good when things are going well? Or is God good when things aren't going so well? Job's answer is one we have to admire. Some of God's dearest saints and most trusted disciples have been people of pain, haven't they? Your hymn book is filled with hymns by Fanny Crosby, who was blind all of her life. And I've told you the story how the Methodist preacher said, isn't it too bad that God did that? And her response is, no, I am so glad he did this, because when I first see again, I'll be able to see Jesus Christ in all of his glory. What a testimony. Now, this is the problem I have with some of these Christian movies, folks. Let me just indulge me for a few minutes, okay? Remember not too long ago I watched one of these, and it's been a while ago. I can't remember the details. But this family was struggling. I think he was a football coach or something. I can't remember. But, he had this old truck, and it wouldn't work, and he couldn't have any kids, and all kinds of things were bad with his life. And suddenly he got right with God, and guess what happened to him? He got a new truck, and he had a baby. Well, he didn't have it. She did. God is still God whether he had the baby or not. God is still God whether they got a new truck or not. And yet we have this tendency to live in this prosperity gospel type idea, don't we? Well, as long as everything's good with me, then it's God's blessing. God can see us through the tough times. You can testify to that, can't you? Because I know you've had tough times in your life. It seems as if heaven is brass. No answers. Things get difficult. God just as real then as he is whenever things are going well. We've got to learn to trust God in the good times and in the bad times, because both will come. Verse 10 is a great reminder. Job remained faithful. And this is a statement that should be true for all of us. We should remain faithful. Can you trust God in the good times? Well, I trust so. Can you trust God in the bad times? I trust so. Fathers need to be the strength of their homes. That means we have to trust God no matter what's going on, because storms are coming. Will storms make us stronger, or will they make us bitter and doubt? Because they're going to come. One of my commentaries, I read this. These three reasons, and I'm going to close with this, why Job's parental example is such a striking thing for us today. And I think this is really worth our consideration as we close our time this evening together. He has three of them. One of them is this. The first one I think is very important. This is why Job's parental example is such a striking reason for us this day and age, is because Job's concern for his children's spiritual welfare displays his spiritual values. Well, that's important. This wasn't something forced. This came from him. This is who he was, the kind of person he was. And his concern for his children, his 10 children, display his spiritual values. Job was a godly man, and he knew the human nature, and he knew the seriousness of evil. He shunned evil himself, and he rightly feared the effect of evil on his children's lives. Boy, we should fear the effect of evil in the world in which we live today. And ask God to protect. He was concerned about his children's spiritual values. That came from his own spiritual values. It wasn't something he put on. It wasn't a garment that he put on for the time. Second, Job's sacrifices for his children reveal his spiritual discernment. It's not enough to produce children who appear outwardly religious and respectable. Oh my goodness. I'm the son of a preacher. And I know all the stories. I've heard them all. Of course, I always thought it was the deacon's kids that messed us up. You know how that was. But I've heard them all. And I went to Appalachian Bible College, and I saw preachers' children at Appalachian Bible College, folks. Sometimes we deserve the reputation that we had. But we must not just have the outward experience. It must be something that motivates the heart. That's when change takes place. Parents need to make inner purity a heart priority, praying for their children. And I would say grandchildren. Third, Job's behavior displays his spiritual responsibility. He understands his position of leadership. He understands that God has placed him in a position. And his primary responsibility is the spiritual upbringing and the welfare of his children. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 would be a verse that would talk about that. And so this Father's Day, I think it's a good reminder for us to think about a man who, as far as I'm concerned, had a lot of good things going for him. He was a man who God could say, he is upright, he eschewed evil. His motivation was right, too. It wasn't just something that he put on for the time, but it was truly who he was as a person. My prayer would be, Lord, make me that kind of an individual, right? I want to be a godly person. I want to have God's blessings. And I want to have God's blessings when the times are tough and when the times are good. I don't want to equate I don't want to be a prosperity gospel person, do you? As long as things are good, God's blessing us. And when things are bad, God's not blessing us. No, God's good through every step of our lives. One day I'll take you to heaven. This new body is getting to be more and more of a treat all the time, isn't it? Boy, no more pains and bad knees and aching backs. Warren and I talking about our physical, I was talking about our physical problem. Warren wasn't. He says he's not going to talk about it anymore. But, all these issues that go on and you sit around and discuss. You get my age, what am I, 68 now? I mean, it becomes a topic of conversation. I got to tell you one story before I go. This lady, I had a checkup the other day, and she tells me, she goes, now you have to remember these 3 words. I'm going to have you repeat them back. Okay, I've got them. So she gave me 3 words. And she's talking to me about some other things, and all of a sudden she goes, now give me those 3 words. I got the first 2. I could not get the third one. I tried, and I tried, and I tried. I know what it is now because she told me it was finger. Folks, it can happen so quickly, can't it? I don't know why he put that in there, but that's not a good way to close. The point is, we got to be individuals who are constantly serving him and thinking about what he's done for us. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for Christ. I thank you for what he's done for us. Father, may we be godly in every area. Help us to be individuals who emulate the example of Job on a daily basis. Concerned about your will and your glory and what you have for us. Father, may you increase and may we decrease. And may we constantly evaluate the days of our lives by what you do for us. Thank you again for all you've done for us. Encourage our hearts. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Dismissed.